Welcome. My name is Jeffrey Taylor, and this podcast is part of the Philosophical Question Series, which is going to be a series of dialogue podcasts between myself and Don Weiss. This podcast is number 19 and is part of the Down the Spirituality and Science Rabbit Hole podcast series. The title of this particular dialogue is Belief in God Reasonable? Now, there are two other podcasts you may be interested in that may relate to this. The previous podcast, number 17, that was done back in June with the title, Does Science Support Belief in an Afterlife?, is one you might want to listen to after this podcast. The other one is the Plato's Cave Allegory podcast about ignorance, and that is podcast number 18. So if you wanted to listen to them in thematic order, it would be thus. You would first listen to the Plato's Cave Allegory podcast, which is number 18, then listen to this one, which is podcast number 19, then go back and listen to podcast 17, which is the Science Support Belief in an Afterlife.
Yeah, it's my name is Don Weiss. It's Friday the 13th, by the way. Did you know that, Jeff?
I did not know that. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, it is. It's Friday the 13th of September 2024. Just for the record. And here we are again, trying to make a start. I've gotten to a certain point in my life. I've reached a certain age. When I want to go over things and I want to get back to fundamentals, that's where I got started with you, Jeff, about wanting to get back to some of the basic questions out of the so-called philosophy of religion, with which I began many, many years ago when I was a student. And I'm looking back over my life and asking myself whether in all the years that I've dealt with the philosophy of religion, I was trained in that field. I taught it for many years on the university level. I still think in terms of its questions, whether in all these years I've learned anything, or perhaps better put, what are my thoughts at this stage of my life? And I have lots of things I want to say, and I know that they coincide with lots of things that you want to say. So I want to get back to the fundamental questions that have vexed me all of my philosophical life as a student and later on as a professor, as I look back over all of these years. And can I summarize where I am right now and what mood? That's maybe a good word at this juncture. What kind of mood I'm in? What do I feel like doing? And I think that this mood that I want to describe is something that you and I share. And I think it's maybe the most important thing to get across first is what is the mood that dominates this whole thing that we do here. And I think the mood is this, that we are people who believe that there is a wonderful inner core of our Judeo-Christian tradition that has been drowned out by all the bullshit, if I may put it in picturesque terms. But I like the term, by the way. That is to say, the world is full of so much bullshit. I mean, people are thirsty for example, evolution. Just one example. But can we get zero bullshit about that to any form of religiosity that takes itself to be in denial of what biological science teaches us about the reality of evolution? This is what I call bullshit. I think we have to use it as a technical term. It's craziness in our day and age. In general, when I say I'm looking for a zero bullshit approach here, is in general, what I'm looking for is whether or not we can talk about or return to the core ideas involved in religiosity, which don't involve the denial of evolution and other unscientific things that don't lend themselves to ridiculous ridiculous forms of credulity and belief in divine intervention in daily affairs and silly things like that. Can we get back to the core of religion?
So, if I understand you correctly, what you'd like to do is have a series of questions that we'll discuss and see what happens.
Yeah, but I'd like to get some focus from the start. I began when I talked to you about this first last week. I read out a kind of litany of questions. I want to read some of them to invite. In other words, yes, but it opens out. It seems to me that in the course of an intelligent discussion, we're going to have something to say about all of the following things. Is it intellectually respectable to believe in God? What does it mean to say God exists? What ought it to mean? What does God do? What does God not do? What's the right way to think about God? What are the wrong ways to think about God? Is there an essence to Judeo-Christian religion? And it's just for starters, by the way, that's a cluster of questions. And I think very often in clusters, I invite you to think so too, because every question is really complex, a whole area of questioning. Another question I could have put down here but didn't, because you can keep being inventive about it, is what can be salvaged from our Judeo-Christian heritage? Some would say not much at all. I'm not one of those people. I think a salvage job, however, is necessary. It's necessary to save, to get back to the savable core, the kernel of the thing. So I want to do that, and I want to do that by way of raising these questions. But what a modern person who is committed to modern forms of rationality might still seek the answer to the question: is there some important relationship that I ought to be in with what our Judeo-Christian background has been talking to us about? God, we sometimes call it. Call it what you want. Is there something of the spirit here which is of desperate importance and is not at variance with science, doesn't ask us to be silly about those things, but actually is compelling? And that's where I think it really gets interesting, because you're a scientist. And here I want to delve into questions of whether or not questions of the spirit actually are quite relevant to what's going on in science, that we need to bring in further ideas from the realm of what we might call spirit to answer questions even within science, that there are spooky things that go on that science itself has discovered, not just acknowledged, but insisted upon. Quantum mechanics is a clear example of that, and the spookiness of quantum mechanics, and the fact that ultimately it has communication at its basis, that the universe itself is a communication thing. Okay, and now, as soon as you have communication, and information theory plays in here too. You know more about that than I do. But as soon as you're talking that way, you're basically talking about the categories of intelligence. It's mind that is at work here. This is a religious idea that the world is spirit and governed by intelligence. That's almost to say God exists. But that leads to all sorts of confusions. We'll save that for a little later. But these are the kinds of things, yes, that I would like to get into at this late stage of my life, because ultimately it's not just a question of answering to our intellectual curiosity, but in the final analysis, what religion has to offer our lives is something quite pointed about human relationship and relationship in general. And it does call us radically and revolutionarily to change our lives in some important ways. I'm not going to get spooky about that or weird, but it does call us to change our ways in an important sense, become new people in a certain sense. And that's common to Judaism and Christianity in their best senses. I'm sorry, I've been dominating the.
Well, no, I think your questions are excellent. And the way you phrased the first one, I think, is quite appropriate. So, should we start with that one?
Okay, the first question is it intellectually respectable to believe in God? Is that the one you mean?
Yes, I think that's phrased in a very interesting way.
You want to say something about that first before I do, because you're the one who suggested it.
Well, it opens up a lot of things, because if most people, I would respond to that with a resounding yes. It's very intellectually respectable to not only investigate God, but have a belief in God. Now, some people, I'm sure, would say, well, isn't that at odds with the fact that you're a scientist? And the fact that immediately tells me that that person is prejudiced in looking at religion as a superstition. And why would a scientist be interested in a superstition? And I think the way that question was phrased allows us to bring God out of the superstition area and into an area that we can actually discuss, because there are many nuances to that question. I would say that there are some ideas about God that are totally ridiculous. For example, if you were going to say, well, the gods reside on Mount Olympus, and if we climb up Mount Olympus, we can have a chat with the gods. Well, that's clearly ridiculous and demonstrably incorrect. So the first thing that comes to mind when we address this question is, what is a serious idea about God that can put it in the realm that not only can be investigated by science, but by philosophers as well? Now, one of the things that I would say is I'm in very good company. You mentioned quantum mechanics. Back in the early 1900s, virtually all of the physicists that were involved in quantum mechanics, from Heisenberg to Einstein to Schrodinger, to basically all of them, today we would consider them mystics. They wrote an extraordinary amount of literature on how quantum mechanics was spiritual in nature. And they wrestled with this because it was very much at odds with Newtonian physics. Quantum mechanics takes us to a place where Newtonian physics can't go. And they were attempting to deal with that. And in doing so, if you ever go back, there's a, I don't remember the name of the book. It's written by Ken Wilber, but the philosopher Ken Wilber, but it's a compilation of articles written by all of these people back in the early 1900s involved in quantum mechanics. And I think if people did that, they'd be astounded with the depth of spirituality that's in the back of the mind of hard-nosed physicists. So I think this opens up the door to, I don't want to say I answer the question yes, because there are a lot of really smart people that said yes too. That's like your mother telling you, if Billy jumps off a cliff, do you want to jump off a cliff too? Truth be told, that there are a number of very intellectually oriented scientists who do believe in God and are actually pursuing it as a means of investigation. And that's where I think that the other thing that I've kind of hinted at here is there's a lot of demonstrable empirical evidence that lends support to the fact that there is some sort of cosmic intelligence. Yeah, I'm searching for a term. You'll find that scientists and philosophers are reluctant to use the word God, not because they're embarrassed by it, but it's got such a broad meaning and such a diverse meaning that it's almost become meaningless. What aspects of God are you talking about? And more importantly, what is your definition of God? Because how you define God basically lays out all of your spiritual pursuits and investigations.
I think that you're on the right track as far as the science is concerned. And I think it leads to the conclusion as an intellectual matter. I think we can present good reasons for believing that the universe actually is structured in a certain way that we can say it's inspirited, it's mind-like in its nature and its form of operation. That, of course, overlaps strongly with some modern philosophy that I'm quite familiar with. Hegel and Marx and others who follow in that tradition of the dialectical tradition have long since treated nature in general that way. And some would say that the fact that the universe actually operates as a kind of rational thing, Hegel did believe that. He believed that history was a rational process, a process wherein mind worked its way through certain levels to higher levels and to higher levels yet, unceasingly, still going on, he would say, and that this incessant dialectic of intelligence, which characterizes all things, he didn't hesitate to say that in religious language we can call this God. He didn't want to say it's a separate thing from the universe, by the way. That's one of the early places where we would get theological, and we run into theological questions like, is God separate from the universe? And you get into all those interesting questions in the philosophy of religion. And I'm not supposing that God is separate from. I think that's a kind of mythical way of talking about God, more properly speaking, might be considered the rationality of the universe in itself. That rationality as a unity and as differentiated all over the universe is.
Well, you hit upon an interesting term there. That's the basis for what things do scientists know that would lead them to believe that there's some form of a God around. And the most important one is, you alluded to it. It would seem that if we go back to Thomas Aquinas, who was a theologian in the Middle Ages, who said we can probably understand God to some degree if we look at the creation. If we assume that God was a part of the creation, then we should be able to deduce some things about God from the creation. And that's where science comes in terms of intelligent design is a phrase that's fallen into disuse and disfavored, mainly because it gives the illusion that there's some sort of mentality that's tinkering with the mechanism, that's, kind of manipulating things and rearranging things. The more common phrase that is used now is that it was an informed creation. What they mean by that is that it appears that information was inserted into the universe at its creation that basically is now unfolding at a certain pace. And it is this information that was implanted in the universe by whatever entity brought it into being. It was stuck in there.
Yeah.
Now,
yeah. The origin of being, which arises in science as the question of the Big Bang, and arises in Hegel as the very first stage of the dialectic, where he's got to explain the emergence of anything out of nothing, and tries to do so, apparently tries to do so. And you call it an unfolding. We have to get into that question of what's going on here. What particular kind of process is this, and what is it from the start? Which seems to be, you called it intelligent design, saying it's not a good term, but it's seeming to be designed to be just the kind of intelligent thing that would be able to develop itself rather rapidly into a universe, a very complex universe, leading to such complex entities as plants and animals and ultimately us.
Well, the reason why it's fallen into disfavor is for one particular reason, is because the word design basically means a dead end. You design a watch and the watch is there, but the watch doesn't change over time. It's a dead end.
That's right.
An informed creation is saying that the information was implanted and it's continuing to unfold, much like your term that you love to use in terms of the universe is pregnant. It's
Right.
pregnant with creativity.
But to get argumentative for just a second, I can tell you in advance that I'm not going to like the idea that it's information. I'm going to like the idea that an impulse or desire is inherent in this notion of intelligence governing all things, because all information is itself modified in the process. What is known to be the case, information, is modified in. So to say that we begin with information, we begin with a certain instruction, let us say, but the instruction, I think, here's one of the truths of our fundamental religion. In an esoteric sense, the instruction is be fruitful and multiply. Creativity, change itself, development is the commandment. And that's what makes it clear that there's intelligence here. Bergson, the French philosopher, when you're looking for terms that have to do with evolution, he wrote a book called Creative Evolution. It's a difficult book, by the way. But the title, all by itself, is instructive. Good title. He summarizes right there. He wants to talk about evolution. He was tremendously informed about what was going on with the revolution that Darwin had created. There was no question throwing out evolution, but the floor was open to discussion of how exactly, in a micro sense, evolution occurred. And there have always been those who have suggested that it is a creative process. The creative evolution is, and that's what I mean in a picturesque sense by be fruitful and multiply, and using that as a metaphor out of the Hebrew Bible, because it occurs a number of times there. That what Yahweh, what God fundamentally says is take what you have and make more of it.
Well, you've hit upon the two concepts I think are very important here. There is a religious concept of God, and then I'll call it a scientific concept of God. And the problem with religious concepts of God is that almost all religions have mutually exclusive definitions for the same God that are thoroughly incompatible. I'll use Judaism for an example. In Judaism, we have the Ein Sof, the God that can't be described, the God that literally you can't even comprehend him. He or she is there, but the human mind is incapable of comprehending it. But then on the other hand, Judaism also has a concept of God as a father and a parent. And the reason why this is because it's very difficult for any person to wrap their minds around, in any sense that's comforting, a God that is totally undescribable and incomprehensible. I can't get close to, or it does me no psychological good to believe in a God that's totally incomprehensible. Yet that concept, I think, is important, because not only do the Jews have it, the Hindus have it as well. They call it neti neti, which means not this and not that, which they say, name any property of God, and as soon as you name it, it can't be God. If you can name a property, there's no way it can be God. That includes love, friendship. These are all human constructs and emotional constructs. God would not have those. Buddhism has the same thing. There are almost two conflicting views of God in any religion. One is very esoteric and brings across the fact that God, for most parts, is incomprehensible. But then the human nature in us wants to make him comprehensible and wants to make him friendly and someone who would be nice to us that we can believe in. And Judaism has this, Christianity has it, Hinduism has it to an extraordinary sense. There are a plethora of gods in Hinduism that aren't really gods. They are aspect of the undefinable God. And if you've ever made the acquaintance of a Hindu, you'll notice there's a mark on their forehead. And the marks are different. That mark on their forehead tells you what aspect of God they identify with. Because there are hundreds of aspects of God in Hinduism. And basically, you pick the one that's most meaningful to you, and that's how you conceive of God. And whether we want to admit it or not, that's pretty much what's done in Judaism and Christianity as well. You pick the aspects of God that you like, that are comforting and fulfilling to you, and then you keep the one that's kind of unrecognizable and unmentionable in the back of your head that's there, but you're not really using it on a day-to-day basis, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but we all make different things. But is there a basic message there that all of us have to acknowledge? Is there something contained in scriptures, something contained? Well, I'm asking it as a question, but you know that I believe that's part of the key is to be found in the great prophets, for example, Isaiah, that there's a conception of life there, that there's a particular way, to get back to your point about incomprehensibility, there's a particular way in which I want to say, on the other hand, let's not go too far with this incomprehensibility business. That it's certainly true that everything that I say as a human formulation is never a last word about and can't claim to some kind of absolute status in that sense. But I think we can talk in plain language about some of the things that we're called upon to be and do in Isaiah and in the best followers of Isaiah, for example, Jesus, who actually wants to say that what I'm asking of you is a change. And you can get it in basic terms. You in your life can get what this is all about. And it's the getting it. Now, here's where I show through, as a philosopher. Hegel says unapologetically that he does want to understand God, and he won't be satisfied with religion unless it is shown to have some kind of rational basis. And he proceeds. I have to tell you, I'm somewhat the same way. I would never claim to have the last word about God or the divine or spirit, nothing like that. But I think we can talk about, just as we can in physics, about where physics has brought us right now and what its problems are, what its accomplishments are, its limitations, its problems, what's up for discussion and whatnot. I think we do the same thing here too. I think we can talk about what has, in the course of history, emerged as desperately important out of the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, for example. That we can talk about that and make it comprehensible in the language of 2024, the current year, the current time, without claiming anything of final or ultimate status. We can say intelligent things about it, begin to have discussions about what it is and what it is not. And in particular, it is a vision of a certain kind of creativity, yes, relatedness, which is seen to inhabit all things. God is love, says John in his first letter. The idea here is that the universe itself is animated by spirit, which in another way of speaking is to say it's animated by love, and that what we are called upon to see is that in the most important sense, this is true of our lives as well. The call to us to come out of our present lives into something better. It has something to do with this whole picture of coming out of antagonism in an act of unification, which is the core to all things. Sometimes I'd like to say that the fundamental law of dialectics is differentiation and then unification, with further differentiation and unification. But it's always a question of bringing together what has fallen into disunity, and that in our age, the world needs to understand how it's got to come out of certain forms of disunity, especially if it's going to survive. We're called upon to see something about the reformation of our own form of life in society. At least since Isaiah, the call has been for us to change our fundamental social relationships. And relationships, relatedness, metaphysically and ethically, has everything to do with everything. So
Well,
like I
you
said,
mentioned
there's a
something.
worldview here. There's a total worldview here. The very strong ethical dimension is what I wanted to say.
Well, you bring up a good point when you mentioned the prophets, because this duality of the unknowable God versus the knowable God that every religion has, it's very evident in the prophets, or not just that, but anyone who's had a deeply religious experience. They cannot put it into words. Look at poor Ezekiel, who had this incredible communication with God that he had to describe it in these incredible terms because it was beyond anything that he could put into language, but he's trying. And that's true of many of the prophets, or even just people I've known that have had a spiritual experience. You ask them to describe it, and they will struggle, and they will then go, I can't. It's something that only they can know.
Well,
And I think this is the
that's a
reason.
wild. That's a wonderful and wild example. Jeff is referring to the first chapter of the prophet Ezekiel, and well, let's not leave out that some people have commented that what's really going on here is the man is on an acid trip. It is very trippy indeed, and the visions that are presented there. But yes, in some sense, it's a marvelous thing that he sees. He presents it as if he actually saw something. However, it's not just
You would bring up an acid trip, because the fascinating thing is people that have spiritual experiences, the molecule DMT that people call the spirit molecule, that puts you in an altered state of consciousness where all sorts of bizarre things happen. That, strangely enough, comes very close to what people are trying to reconcile. They've had this experience that they can't put into words, yet it was very real to them. And if you say, well, hey, you were day tripping, they'll go, absolutely not. It really happened to me. And that, I think, just kind of summarizes the dichotomy and the struggle that anyone who's dealing with religion has to come to grips with. You're not going to figure it all out. Logic and reason will take you only so far. Then it goes beyond that. So I just want to kind of point out why we have these vastly divergent ideas of God, depending on people's experiential relationship with things that have happened. So yeah, you can describe certain things in terms of scientific words. You dislike the word information. That would be a primary word that a scientist would probably use to try and describe what God is. That doesn't register well with you. And that simply is pointing out the differences of the two poles that are in different people. You identify more with the North Pole, A scientist identifies more with the South Pole.
And
And
I love the information, but information is always being changed. The content of things is always changing because it's always grist to the mill of further change, and it's the change itself that is the intelligent thing. We live in development. Stasis is death. We're alive. Things are always in flux, and that's where intelligence lives. That's all I'm saying, and not liking information. Information makes it seem as if you just plug some facts into the thing, a certain kind of series of truths. Instead, I think what you plug into the thing is the ability to develop itself into higher and higher levels of intelligence itself. It's just a preferred way of talking. Yeah. No, I don't think I disagree with you about all that much that you were trying to express by using the word information. I was just actually on a more modest level suggesting that I don't like that word as much because it seems to suggest something to me of just data that you're putting in there rather than a way to keep moving on intelligently and develop intelligently.
I want to kind of digress for just a second to go back because at the beginning of our discussion here, I used a number of generalities about there's a ton of empirical information that would lend support to the concept of something like God. So I'm sure that there's someone out there saying, well, name one at least. So let me be specific. If you look at DNA, DNA is behind all life, at least that we know of. Now, DNA is something that can be investigated both mathematically and statistically. Now, there's a number of scientists that would like to say, well, DNA just randomly put itself together and there are enough changes and mutations, and all of a sudden we have DNA that's capable of making the first single-celled animal. And then from that, the DNA changes and you get multi-celled animals all the way up to mammals and things like that. Well, that's easily investigated. DNA is a language that has 4 letters. First of all, the one thing that DNA is a code. It is a language. Any language has to have someone speaking it or formulating it, and it also has to have someone that understands it. You put me in France, and we're not going to do much communicating because I don't speak French. Well, if DNA is a language, then a language can't randomly and spontaneously develop through random change. DNA has 4 letters. You can calculate the statistics of how many mutations you would have to come up with the amount of DNA information in just a single cell that controls a single cell. That amount of information couldn't have been formulated randomly with the time that the universe has been here. It just can't be done. DNA is a code. That implies there had to be a creator of the code. You have to have someone who's writing the code and someone who's reading the code. There's a $5 million prize for anyone that can point to a demonstrably provable natural language that assembled itself randomly. They're fairly sure they're not going to have to pay it out because just the fact of what DNA is implies that someone had to put it together and then insert it into the universe. That's just one example.
Here's my response. I'm not going to respond to your argument as such. It's going to be a kind of a meta remark about such arguments. Because you may have your hands on a very good argument for the existence of God. Let's admit that you do. The problem that I have is that over the course of a career, I've noticed that arguments only get you so far. That every time somebody formulates a good argument, there's somebody who's going to have some kind of reason for doubt, well formulated in science itself. You know that's the problem. You know too well that although you consider that a good argument, it isn't accepted all over the scientific community. You might say if they started to look into it, they should be perplexed, but they're not looking into it and they're not perplexed. And so science itself doesn't pay much attention to your argument. You know, it's a good one, but where does it get us in the discussion? So I kind of gave up at a certain point in my life of engaging in this kind of level of intellectual discussion of proving that my point of view about God was right and so forth, and turning to different kinds of issues. Like, what kind of worldview is at work here? Why do I believe that it's a good one? And how can I make it work? And how can I improve it? And so forth. And what kind of valuable approaches and ideas can I share with and learn also in my contact with other people, which is what I would like to get out of a discussion group. I just want to get back into these kinds of talks, Jeff. Somebody who's actually watching this might say, is this particular? No, not this particular conversation. In fact, all of these things we've been doing are kind of examples of the kinds of digressions. You called it a digression at one point, but that's right. Let's digress in various ways, cover various kinds of question. Let me digress into the question, what's the relationship between all this and immortality? Haven't even used the word today. That whole cluster of questions, which was, by the way, my fourth cluster. I didn't read it. I read it to you, but I didn't read it aloud today. There are all these clusters of questions that I want to get back to and get a philosophical discussion going about, and to use the contemporary media like what we have here.
Well, you hit upon the final goal of all this. I didn't go through that explanation to prove the existence of God, because you can't do that.
Right.
However, it does cause me to think in certain directions.
Yes.
That's very important for people. If you think life is meaningless and random and has no purpose, then why are you here? Why would you even want to wake up in the morning? What motivates you to do anything? There are a number of studies that have been done on identical twins that are brought up in different environments, that people that have a positive outlook on life, that are involved and engaged with other people, doing things to help people, functioning in the world that you would say religion functions in, they live longer than people that don't. So there is an ultimate reason for this. My reason is not to prove anything, because science can't prove anything. Anything in science is one experiment away from being disproved. There can be a preponderance of the evidence of stuff that can make you comfortable with feeling a certain way, which is where I am at with the answer to your question. In my opinion, based on the things that I've shared, it's not intellectually inconsistent for me to consider God.
Mm-hmm. And that would be just one topic.
We have yet to scratch the surface. There's so much more.
Yeah, but I want to get back before we sign off. I do want to get back to that question that you just began to broach. People who find that life may be meaningless, surely that is where religion is supposed to come in. And surely there must be things that we can say about the meaning question. Do we have good reason to believe that there is such a thing as a meaningful existence? Religion has answered positively to that question, and I still do.
Oh,
I still think
if
it's
you,
worth talking about this whole thing on a very personal level. Why looking at the world in a certain way and living my life in a certain way resonates, is good, works, and may even be. I want that question of immortality, I want to keep going, because I don't think it's just this life we're talking about. I know this may seem odd for a philosophy professor, a rational type like me. But one of the things that opens up that I do want to discuss, a further issue area that I've mentioned once or twice, is whether or not this whole realm of spirit that is opened up does tell us something other than what materialism teaches us about the prospects of the continuation of intelligence. Whether it ceases or not, that's that cluster I was talking about most lately. I want to get a discussion going about those things too. So yes, all of these questions, yeah, I'd like to discuss them all. Just
yeah, and
begin.
if you go from the scientific back to the religious, if you look at Judaism and the teachings of Jesus, they're about how do you connect with God or whatever you want to call it and change your life to do something different. Jesus said there's a part of God, and Judaism says there's a part of God that lives in everybody. If you acknowledge that, then it's very difficult to do things that people do to each other if you're looking at someone that has the same part of God in him as you do. So it's a way of changing your outlook on the world. And one of the things that is almost universal in anyone who's had a near-death experience, where in that near-death experience, there's a religious component to it about whether they go to heaven, whether they meet somebody, they come back a totally changed person. That experience and that information that was given to them caused almost anyone that has these to rearrange their life. So just from that standpoint, it's worth trying to understand so that we can replicate it.
Well, I began by noting that it's Friday the 13th. Let me end by saying that I think that it was very fortunate rather than unlucky Friday the 13th that we got a chance to get back together and launch this thing. I want to stress launch it, because let's just start having these things. Let's record some of them, and let's see if we can get a Zoom discussion seminar going about these things.
You drop that in my lap, and I have to comment. Friday the 13th would be called a superstition, but it has a basis in fact. It was Friday the 13th that all of the Templars were arrested by the Pope, and they were totally destroyed as an organization. So Friday the 13th resonated through history. Most people can't tell you why Friday the 13th is unlucky, but something did happen on that day that caused it to feel unlucky. Since I'm not a Templar living in the Middle Ages where the Pope can kill me, I'm pretty confident Friday the 13th is not going to be bad for me.
Those Templars were pretty rich. That's something I think that's part of the Humphrey Bogart story in the Maltese Falcon, by the way. It's quite a good story you tell about Friday the 13th. I had no idea, Jeff. So thank you for that.
Yeah, well, the Templars were rich. They had a lot of money. The King of France did not. And it was the King of France that went to the Pope and said, we got to do something about this. And it was the ultimate SWAT raid in the Middle Ages. On one day, every single Templar church or rectory or castle, or they were all simultaneously attacked on the same day. So just interesting. Yeah, I couldn't leave the superstition part of it. That particular part is superstition that's based on a reason, not the same as spirituality.